Well, good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress here. Today, I'm going to be discussing mental health testimony and cross examining mental health testimony. Um, I had hoped we wouldn't wind up here, but I kind of anticipated we would eventually wind up at this point. Um, I had to give forensic psychology every opportunity to correct themselves, to self correct before we reached here, which is a kind of a brutal place because we're going after licenses and there's potentially a lot of professionals who could be hurt um, in the coming situation, and I don't like to do that. But it has to happen. They're doing what they're doing, which is colluding with the psychological abuse of children and the psychological abuse of their parents, and they're not stopping. And so the what I have always recognized is that the forensic psychologists have to testify in support of their reports. And so all of the unethical practices and incompetence issues that plague the field of forensic psychology are all vulnerable to cross examination. But unfortunately for the parents out there, there's a cover up within forensic psychologists because they all do the same thing. And so they all collude on the spousal abuse and child abuse and incompetence and exempt themselves from ethical standards. And the attorneys and parents don't know where the vulnerabilities are, don't know what the standards of practice are that should be, the forensic psychologist should be held accountable for. And it's always been about the forensic psychologists. The PAS experts, Gardner people, are just a sideshow. They have no power. They're a fringe group. The power is with the forensic psychologists. And you can think of, if you see board certified in forensic psychology, board certified forensic psychologist, them. So that's going to be kind of interesting. Dr. Childress against board certified forensic psychologists. Great, you're board certified. Are you competent in the assessment of delusional thought disorders? No. I'm not sure what your board certification qualifies you to do because you're not competent with the pathology. It is what it is. It's a delusional thought disorder. If you're not competent in the assessment of delusional thought disorders, you're not competent with this pathology. So they have to testify. But then that, to actually hold them accountable, requires that I then be in the family courts to be able to help the attorneys develop their lines of questions, which is what I'm doing essentially right now. So as that develops, I will be providing you, parents, more broadly with the information about cross examining mental health testimony so that you can use it, because this needs to be a distributed solution. It can't all be about me. The age of experts is over. I am your transitional object, a transitional expert to the age of no experts. Bowlby, Minuchin, Beck, those are your experts. The research is your experts. Turn to that. I'm just a transitional object because I have the competence in delusional thought disorders and family systems and um, you know attachment pathology, and I have the competence where they don't. So I came up 12 associate clinical signs, 3 diagnostic indicators, parenting practices rating scale. You do those diagnostic checklist, parenting practices rating scale, you will 100% diagnose the pathology and never misdiagnose it. But ultimately, everybody needs to go back to Bowlby and attachment and Linehan and Milan on personalities and the dark personality research and attachment Bowlby and Stern and Tronick, and actually turn to the real research on stuff. So let's talk a little bit about how to approach forensic mental health testimony in the courts or mental health testimony. Now, you get two testimonies, actually, of several different categories, but basically, you'll have the forensic custody evaluators. Those are the ones who do the 6 month forensic evaluation, and it's very standardized what they do. 20 to $40,000, and they'll come back with a big report. So that's one category. You'll have reports coming in from reunification therapists. There's no such thing. Oftentimes, the reunification therapists are the custody evaluators for somebody else. So somebody does a custody evaluation, and this custody evaluator becomes the reunification therapist, and that evaluator becomes the reunification therapist for the other. So it's an incestuous kind of thing in the family courts of the mental health people. Um, but you'll get reports in sometimes from the reunification therapists. And then you have the doctoral level people. Oftentimes, those are the forensic evaluators, not always, but often. And then you'll have the master's level people. Often, those are the reunification therapists, not always, but often. And so, those are sort of the reports you get in. Then you have GAL reports and parenting coordinator reports and things, but those are less um, useful, less comprehensive because they're not uh, fully mental health reports. Um, and so when I'm going to focus in my talk today on the psychologists, because as the psychologists go, everybody goes. So if the psychologists move to the application of knowledge and doing an assessment for persecutory delusions, then the master's level people will too, and the reunifications do. Everybody will follow the forensic psychologists or forensic psychology where that goes. And it's going down right now. But when it reorganizes, they will follow the psychologists. So I'm going to be using the APA ethics code, and I'll be talking about cross-examining psychologists' testimony. Now, as you approach, if you're talking to an attorney or a parent who's representing pro se, as you're approaching cross-examining the testimony, don't think in terms of individual questions that are going to illuminate the situation. Think lines of questions, because what you're going to be doing is exposing a thought disorder in the mental health person. Yes, they have a thought disorder. Holy cow. It's an absence of linear logical thinking. There's an absence of self-reflective insight, and there's an absence of foresight and planning ahead. So you're gonna captivate them on that, on their failure of their frontal lobes, their thought disorder, and by holding them to a linear logical line of questions, you're going to expose the absence of linear logical thinking and that thought disorder, and go boop. And when you do, you're going to go, oh my goodness, I guess I'm wrong. And my goal, as I'm consulting with attorneys, is to have the mental health person, the forensic psychologist, admit to their ethical violations and their malpractice in their testimony. I'd like them to say, "No, I violated ethical standards, and this is malpractice. I participated in the psychological abuse of the child and failed in my duty to protect obligations." That's my goal, is to get them to say that on the stand. And I think it's a reasonably achievable goal. We'll see what happens. And so you stay on lines of questions. And the opening sets of questions are actually the setups. Those are the ones that are going to get them saying the things that then you lock them into on the second half of the questions. And so, you move through questions, get them documenting, get them into exposing their vulnerability, and then you come back with the lines of questions. And so there's three basic lines of vulnerability that they have. One is around no diagnosis. So this is all the forensic custody evaluations, all the forensic child custody evaluations. They never diagnose anything. So they are uniformly vulnerable to this line of questions about no diagnosis. And you'll hear them say, I don't diagnose pathology. I don't like to pathologize people. They're in trouble. And their own AFCC standards for forensic conducting forensic psychology. It says don't or try not to diagnose. It really encourages them not to use diagnostic labels. So they're telling their psychologists to get themselves into trouble. The second line is the misdiagnosis line. For that one, that is predicated a lot on the word possibly. Is it possible that? Is it possible that there's a shared delusion? Is it possible there's a cross generational coalition? Is it possible? The moment they admit it's possible, they're in a whole lot of trouble because they didn't assess for it, they didn't discuss it, and they misdiagnosed the other possibility because they never even considered it, the other possibility. And that's the thought disorder again. They didn't even consider half of the world, your half, the targeted parents half, what they're saying. They just said, well, they're not abusive, but okay. Well, if they're not abusive, if the targeted parent isn't abusive, then the other parent is. They're psychologically abusing the child by creating the shared delusion. It's one way or the other, but that's a thought disorder. They don't see it as one way or the other. They see, well, if there's no child abuse by the targeted parent, they're they don't even look. They don't fall. There must be abuse by the other. No, they don't even look. And so that's the thought disorder. So the moment you get them saying it's possible, uh-oh, that's something they never considered. And then the third line of questions, and the one I'd leave to the final line, is the ethical lines. And that's going to center around standard 2.04 and standard 9.01. 2.04 is the entry point. That's bases for scientific and professional judgments. Bases for their judgments is the established knowledge of professional psychology. Very short and sweet. You must apply the established knowledge. And then that links to standard 9.01, which is bases for assessment, which cites back to 2.04 right at the end. So it's a nice little circle. And that's where we ultimately land, which is that their opinions, as contained in their recommendations, reports, diagnostic or evaluative statements, including their forensic testimony, are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. Okay. The information is standard 2.01. The techniques is the mental status exam of thought and perception. And so you get all that laid out ahead of time, that they didn't apply family systems knowledge. They didn't apply delusional thought disorders. They didn't apply um, attachment knowledge. They didn't apply any established knowledge, 2.04. They didn't conduct a mental status exam of thought and perception, which is for to identify delusional thought disorders. So therefore, their opinions as contained in their reports and the stuff are not based on information 2.04 and techniques mental status exam sufficient to substantiate their findings. And for the ethics line, I like to start with, or I recommend. So I don't question these folks. I'm not an attorney, but if I was, I would start with a set of standard questions, which is, Doctor, is the APA ethics code um, optional or mandatory? Okay, it's mandatory. It's required. Okay, then uh, then I'd give them the ethical standard, let's say 2.04. Doctor, would you please read this standard? Do you agree with standard 2.04? Do you comply with standard 2.04? Yes, yes. Why is standard 2.04 important? What bad thing would happen if you didn't apply the established knowledge of professional psychology? Okay. And so then I do that with any ethical standard. I give them 9.01. Read that for me, please. Do you agree with it? Do you comply with it? Why is that important? And then when I'm doing 9.01, I would ask him about that 2.04. I notice, it's 9.01 here, bases of assessment, cites back specifically to 2.04, bases for professional judgments. Why is that? Why is it important in doing your assessments to apply the established knowledge of professional psychology? Okay, and get them to hang themselves starting off, and then get them to document on the record that they didn't apply the established knowledge. And I would focus on three domains. Family systems is your strong one, attachment's really strong, and delusional thought disorders. Okay, those are your three that you get them to acknowledge that they didn't apply, and ask them where in your report do you talk about cross generational coalitions. Where in your report do you talk about these things? But let me jump back up to the top and talk about the no diagnosis, and then I'll come back down and get to ethics once again. So, with no diagnosis, that is immensely thought disordered because in clinical psychology, we're told to always put your diagnosis on all your formal paperwork as a risk management thing. And I train my trainees or my postdocs and interns always put your diagnosis on your formal paperwork because it's a risk management thing. Because here's why. If you fail to put your diagnosis down, then you are asserting for a fact that you have verified that there is no diagnosable pathology present. Because if there was a diagnostic pathology present, you would have diagnosed it and told people and told the court. Okay. But you didn't. There's no diagnosis present, not even by a rule out, which is rule out. R/O means it's possible. And so you're not even saying there's a rule out of possible child abuse, psychological abuse, or possible delusional disorder, or possible fractures. You're not even saying it's possible. There's no rule out. So no diagnosis indicates there is no diagnosable pathology present, and that's fact. Now, that's going to be a problem when you get them to the next phase, which is the misdiagnosis lines of questions, which says, is it possible? Did you do a mental status exam, a thought and perception for a possible delusion? No, I didn't, because they don't know how to do it. They've never been, have you ever been trained in how to do it? No. So then is it possible there is a persecutory delusion in it? Or are you going to say it is not possible, that there is absolutely for a fact no possibility that there is a persecutory delusion? Now, mental health people, if you know my psychology, they're scared little bunnies. They will always run away from always and never questions, and they will always take the possible questions, so the middle range. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Is it never? Is it that there is no possibility that this is a persecutory delusion? Well, no, it's possible there's a persecutory delusion. But you didn't diagnose anything, did you? Not even by a rule out. You didn't even discuss that in your report, did you? Where in your report do you discuss the possibility that it's a persecutory delusion? Oh my goodness, now they're stressing out. Now, doctor, hypothetically, if a parent is producing a persecutory delusion and a false attachment pathology in the child, creating a psychotic disorder, persecutory delusion in the child that's destroying the child's attachment bond to the other parent, would that be a DSM diagnosis of child psychological abuse? Yes, it would. If they try to equivocate on that, say, holy cow, doctor, a psychosis of parents producing a psychotic disorder in the child and destroying their attachment system, and that's not child psychological abuse. What would be? if that's not child psychological abuse. So yeah, it's child psychological abuse. Hypothetically, creating a delusional disorder in the child's psychological child abuse. Okay. So then is it possible there is child psychological abuse by the allied parent who's created this persecutor? Is that possible? If they say it's possible, they're in trouble because they didn't report it. They didn't diagnose it. You don't like to diagnose because you don't like to pathologize, do you, doctor? No, I don't like to diagnose. That's why you didn't put your diagnosis anywhere here, because you don't like to diagnose people as having pathology. Okay. If a parent had schizophrenia, would you diagnose that and tell the court, or would you withhold that information from the court? And I'd use the word withhold information from the court because that's what they're doing. They are withholding relevant diagnostic information from the court. Now, they believe it's because the diagnostic information has greater prejudicial value than probative value. Well, that's not the call of the psychologist. That's a call of the attorneys and law people. We, as doctors, just simply report what we know, which is the diagnosis. We identify what the problem is, and we identify it in professional level language so we're clear. And everybody knows what the problem is because we're talking in professionally defined terms when we identify what the problem is. We diagnose what the problem is. That's what doctors do. But these forensic psychologists, they don't do that. So they don't diagnose. So would you tell the court about schizophrenia, or would you withhold that information from the court? What if there was child abuse, doctor? Would you diagnose the child abuse, or would you withhold that information from the court? Now they'll say yes to that. They'll say, oh, yes, I diagnose child abuse and tell the court. Well, this is possible child psychological abuse, and you didn't even put it as a rule out. But now you're telling me it's possibly there, but you didn't even assess for it because you didn't conduct a mental status exam with on perception, did you, doctor? Do you even know how to conduct a mental status? Are you even competent to be assessing the pathology you're working with? Now, if they try to scoot around the pathology they're working with, that's when you drop in the Walters and Friedlander quote from the journal Family Court Review. And you can get real solid on this. You say, do you know who publishes the journal Family Court Review? You're a forensic psychologist. You know who publishes? The the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the AFCC. Okay, are you a member of the AFCC? Okay, that's their flagship journal, the journal Family Court Review. In 2016 Family Court Review, Walters and Friedlander say that it's a persecutory delusion. See these quotes? There's delusion, 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 delusion. They refer to it as delusion. Oh my goodness, they cite Childress. Okay, so they're citing children. The authorities in Family Court Review are citing Childress that there's a persecutory delusion. So if there's any question about whether Childress is accepted, yes, I am. By the forensic psychologist, Family Court Review, Walters and Friedlander. So every forensic psychologist, based on that article, should be aware that it's a potential shared persecutory delusion. So they should be doing a proper assessment to see if that's there. They should know that coming in. If they don't, they're an incompetent forensic psychologist. Now, they are incompetent psychologists just simply because they are a forensic psychologist, but they are not only that they are incompetent as a forensic psychologist if they are not taking into consideration Walters and Friedlander 2016. This is a possible persecutory delusion. So you just give them that quote to read up on the witness stand and say, do you agree with that? Do you agree with Walters and Friedlander that that's sometimes the case? Put sometimes the case. Well, yeah, sometimes it's okay. Did you assess for that in this situation? Is it possible it's here in this situation? So that's your first two lines of questions. No diagnosis, and then into misdiagnosis, into possible. Then the third one is the ethics line. And so I'll be wrapping up here, but the ethics line, you kind of start with your standard. Do you agree with that? You follow that. Why is that important? And then, now you didn't, for those, I would do three pathologies: family systems, attachment, and delusional thought disorders. Start with family systems. You say, what is family systems therapy? You do that with all of them. So what is family systems therapy? What is the attachment system? And what is uh, what is a persecutory delusion? But when you reach each one, start with what is family systems therapy? What is a cross generational coalition? What is an emotional cutoff? What is an inverted hierarchy? What is an enmeshment in a relationship? And now, did you apply the knowledge? Why would it be important to apply the knowledge of family systems to the assessment of family conflict? Why? And family systems is one of the some of the established knowledge, right? Okay. Where in your report did you apply the knowledge of family systems to your as a basis for your professional judgments? Nowhere. Okay. All right. So let's do the next one. Attachment. What is the attachment system? Why would it be important with a child rejecting a parent? Would that be an attachment pathology? Why would it be important to apply the scientific evidence on the attachment system to assessing and diagnosing it and treating attachment pathology? Okay. Where in your report did you discuss the child's attachment pathology and the attachment system? Okay. And where in your background do you have background treating attachment pathology? That all comes out of early childhood mental health. They don't have any. But then the third one, I put the two stronger ones on front and back. That's family systems and the delusional thought disorder. Delusional thought disorders. What are they? What's a persecutory delusion? Okay, what's the assessment for a persecutory delusion? It's a mental status examathon perception. Are you trained in conducting a mental status? Did you conduct a mental status examathon perception? You didn't discuss it anywhere in your report. So did you conduct a proper assessment for a possible delusional thought disorder? Do you think, based on this, doctor, that we need an additional assessment here to get a clinical diagnostic risk assessment for possible psychological child abuse, for possible shared persecutory delusion? Do you think we should get a proper clinical assessment for that? And if they say yes, if they say no, we shouldn't get an assessment for a proper assessment for psychological child abuse, that's a problematic answer for them. But if they say yes, we should get a proper assessment, which they will because they're feeling so vulnerable from all the other questions that they couldn't answer. They'll say, yes, we should get a proper assessment to see if there's a delusional thought disorder here. Then they're dead in the water, because then the next question becomes, do you mean to tell me that after 6 months of treatment, there's a year of treatment, or after 6 months or 9 months of your evaluation, we still need another assessment because you failed to conduct a proper assessment for possible child abuse? Okay, doctor, if you've conducted a 9-month assessment and we still need another assessment for possible child abuse, have you failed in your duty to protect obligations, doctor? But you didn't even, where in your report do you discuss the recommendation that we should get a proper risk assessment for child abuse? Where in your report do you say that? So you didn't even inform the court that there's possible child abuse, but now you're telling us we should get a risk assessment for possible child abuse because you didn't conduct one in your 9 months of assessment. You did not conduct a proper assessment for possible child. You can spin them up all sorts of places at the end. And I would just close it off just because I'm kind of that way. I would just ask them at the end question. So, doctor, reviewing everything that we've discussed in your testimony here and looking at standard not 2.04 again, would you say you fulfilled your ethical obligations under standard 2.04 to apply the established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline as the bases for your professional judgments? They'll say yes, because they can't say no. They can't admit they've violated ethical standards on the stand. So they'll say yes, but it's clearly not, because families, you take them through family systems, no. Attachment, no. Delusional thought disorders, no. Nothing. So, and the family systems, Minuchin diagram, that'll just be killer for them. And then do the same with 9.01 right after. And don't argue with them, but just let them say, yes, I did. Everybody goes, no, you didn't. And then ask them 9.01. And did you fulfill your obligations based on everything we've been discussing? Did you fulfill your ethical obligations? And are your opinions based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings? Your findings. Now, he just said it's possible there's psychological child abuse or shared persecutory delusion. It's possible, and he didn't even assess for it. So now they're going to say, yeah, they're based on sufficient to substantiate my findings. They'll have to say yes, because they can't admit that they violated ethical standards on the stand under oath with a court reporter present. So they'll say yes, but it'd be obvious that the answer is no. And then with the licensing board complaint, it becomes an issue that they lack self-reflective insight into their professional failings if they think that's acceptable practice. That they're fulfilling their obligations under the ethical standards based when they're not. So with that, I'm going to run off to my Sunday here. So everyone, happy coffee with Dr. Childress, and I hope you have a terrific Sunday. And then I'm going to get back to working on my reports. I'm a working guy on Sundays. So with that, take care, everybody. Bye bye.